Welcome to the Honest Health Podcast with your host, Jeffrey Burke. Honest Health brings you the brightest minds in the natural products industry, as well as athletes and entertainers. Jeff will keep you entertained and informed while educating on how to be successful on your healthy journeys. Now, here's your host, Jeffrey Burke.
Hello and welcome back to the Honest Health Podcast. My name is Jeffrey Burke. I'm so glad you're here. Remember, my platform is the one you go to when you want to get groundbreaking information from some of the best minds within the natural products industry, as well as voices outside of the industry, because everybody brings something to the table. Everybody has something that could influence a decision, answer a question for you, and maybe bring you that tidbit of information that you need. Keep your mind open, keep your heart open, because you never know when good information is going to come your way. Hey, if you like what we're doing, do me a favor, go to my YouTube channel, Honest Health, and make sure that you like, subscribe, and follow so we can get more people to get these wonderful guests and their interviews out. The better the following, the better distribution of these wonderful interviews. And make sure that you follow me on all the platforms that I'm on. I'm on them all. And I try to bring great information to everybody. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Robin Rogosin, and we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about the industry. We're going to be talking about her take, her amazing amount of industry experience. We're also going to talk about, some of the changes, some of the things that she's seen, some of the things that she's feeling, because my job is to shine the light on my guest, and we're going to do that today. So help me welcome my guest. Hey, Robin.
Hey, Jeffrey. It's so good to be here with you.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have you here. I know we've been talking about this for a while, and we finally get to get this done and get it recorded and get it out for people to see. And I'm so happy to have you here.
What a pleasure.
Let me ask you a question. You and I are in the old timer category, I hate to say, but we've been around for a long time, even though we both started when we were 2 years old. We've learned a lot. We've seen a lot. If I had to ask you one question about what you think is the biggest plus of our industry now, what would you say?
The biggest plus. I think, from my perspective, our industry is about supplements, body care, healthy food. And I think there's such an abundance. The abundance is really the biggest key, but it's a double-edged sword. There's an abundance. I looked up the other day, there's over 10,000 brands of supplements on Amazon. So there's an abundance of products. There's an abundance of selection, at least online. In retail, I find the selection kind of getting narrower, but online it's amazingly abundant. And it requires that you educate yourself and figure out, what the best choices for you are based on your health, based on your orientation, whether you're, doing a paleo diet or a vegan diet, there's a selection of everything. And I remember from working in the stores at Whole Foods that I remember the early days of finding things that were gluten-free, finding things that were, free of seed oils, finding things that were, and all the customers that were looking for all these things. It's been a long time, but when I think about it, one of the things that I always go back to is kind of the history of the industry. The history of the industry was so interesting because there was this period of food technology development, that started with like the Kellogg's and cereals and things like that, and a lot of packaged food. And then there was kind of a challenge to that. And the challenge to that was people like the DeVosses and the Van Andels at Amway and their alfalfa tablets, for example, and I think of that as kind of the early part of the natural products industry where people were kind of questioning kind of the technological orientation around food in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and it's continued definitely, we know. So I think about the early part of the supplement industry, and it felt like at that time it was all about family companies, There was like William Thompson Vitamin Company that was family owned and operated. There was Janet Zand and Michael McGuffin doing McZand Herbals. There was Rosemary Gladstar and Drake Sadler doing traditional medicinal teas.
Mm-hmm.
There was Twin Lab, the Bleckmans, that was a whole family of, two sets of twins, and then Dean being the youngest and owning Twin Lab for ages, which was a preeminent supplement company. And then the Skolniks at Solgar. I can think of so many examples of that family orientation, even like Patricia Bragg, who was Paul Bragg's daughter-in-law. There was a lot of family in those days. The Bronners, the Lundbergs,
Mm-hmm.
and I think about that, and I think about how in the evolution of the industry, it's gone from, that family orientation to, because we've garnered so much attention, there's a lot of money interests that are not part of this family tradition, that are now in the industry. And I find it fascinating, but it also feels like a win because we've gotten so much attention and the industry has become so much more popular than it ever was before because of this broadening and because so many people were really interested in what's the best supplement, what's really a natural body care product. Is organic food enough, or should we be doing biodynamic food and now regenerative organic foods and supplements? I think looking at the trajectory of the history of the industry, it's been fascinating, and I think it provides a lot of lessons about what people are looking for and how to be responsive to the people who we serve.
That's very, very true. And I couldn't agree more. When I first started in the industry, you and I have been around for decades now. And at the very beginning, we didn't have a wide selection to choose from. There were maybe 2 or 3 natural sodas, maybe 2 or 3 potato chips. The calcium products weren't even calcium. We had bone meal and dolomite. We didn't even talk about vitamin D back then. And now vitamin D is actually something they test for in your blood workup. The probiotics, were called acidophilus, and they were only recommended to use for 7 days after an antibiotic. So it's been an amazing transition. There were no blends, there were no combinations. You couldn't walk in and say, do you have a combination for my eyes, for my immune system, for my joint? We didn't have any of that. You had to figure it out on your own. And then if you did research and you thought of something, then you had to find it. And then if you found it, you had to figure out how much to use. And then you had to figure out how much could you mix it with other things. So there was so much work involved. And today it's become almost a luxury to be able to walk into a brick and mortar health food store and talk with people that have such great knowledge and be able to pinpoint what you're doing and make it about you, not about everybody else, but about you and your individual situation. I've seen a lot since the pandemic. And as I travel, because I travel so extensively, there are people that are really so glad to come back to the health food stores again, to be able to have a conversation and in a one-on-one. And I'm seeing it everywhere around the United States. And, people got so stuck at being home and pushing buttons and having everything delivered, but there was no conversation. And now they're going back because they want that again. And isn't it wonderful that we still have all of these great resources for people to go and have great conversations and be able to educate and make it personal for that person individually about their health and well-being. And to me, that's the part of the industry that I love the best.
I totally agree with you. And I feel like it's kind of the missing link. And I think you're right that after COVID, there was a real interest in people being able to talk to people and talk to them face to face. So and then there are retailers that are doing such a fabulous job. Locally, I think about Lassen's and Lazy Acres and even Sprouts and Whole Foods that are really still upholding standards and being the curator for some of the best products out there. And if you're online wondering, is this a good product or not? Sometimes being able to go into your local health food store and asking them what they think about that product, or if they have something similar to what you saw online or what you saw, on social media, is a really good way of going about it, because they are talking to people within the industry who know what's going on, and they know who's done clinical studies, and they know who has traditional historical knowledge, and they know, the people in the stores know a lot, and thank goodness for that.
Well, I think the other thing is, we are at a place in our world right now where, we have a different viewpoint of the medical establishment today than we did before. Coming up as I was, because I'm well into my 60s now. So I've been around a long time, and I love it that I'm able to still do what I do. But, there was a time when your doctors were on a pedestal, and, they've earned that status, and, we would listen to everything they said, and that was perfectly fine. But, back then we didn't have as many of the alternatives available at our fingertips, and we didn't have the knowledge about the alternatives available. So today we do. So back then, there was really kind of a controversy and a friction and a non-cooperation relationship between this side of the fence and this side of the fence. Because I remember there was a time when you couldn't even tell your doctor you were taking any supplements because they didn't want to hear it. Now today I'm giving lectures to doctors at hospitals because they want to know what's going on. So it's a different way of thinking. But, interestingly enough, today people are like, well, I understand that that's a medication, and medications have their place. I am never going to say anything against that, because there are times when medications are the only alternative. There are times when medications save your life and keep you on this planet when you may have had your demise a long time before without that medication. But do I feel that every single time that it's only the medication as an alternative? I don't. I think that many places around the world, sometimes medication is the last stop. So I think this is where it comes into reading and asking questions and having a physician that is maybe a little bit more nutritionally oriented, because many of them know what's available now. And I mean, every time I'm in a health food store, more times than none, if I'm in the section, I'll see somebody come in with a handwritten prescription for vitamin D or magnesium or a multiple vitamin or pycnogenol or, something like a red yeast rice or CoQ10 because they're on a statin. And I think to myself, these are doctors that are sending people in for things that years ago they never would have even considered. So I mean, I think we're getting better. I still think we have a long way to go. But I mean, that's a different way the industry is working these days. There is a little bit of cooperation and a little kind of natural codependency together, because they know that people are looking sometimes for an alternative.
I think that's true. And I see that too. And I've seen that over the years, even into the 80s and 90s. I remember seeing there were a handful of doctors that would write prescriptions, and they would be, I remember specifically one plastic surgeon in the neighborhood where I worked in a store, and he would write prescriptions for vitamin E internally, vitamin A internally, vitamin C internally. And it was really interesting to see that burgeoning kind of understanding that, supplements have a place and people need to be well nourished. And when the first step of helping somebody be healthy is amping up their nourishment, and that can be done with food clearly, and it can be done with the aid of supplements. When I first started, I was reading books like Pavel Rola's How to Get Well. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. I do.
And I felt like, hey, this is a doctor. He was a naturopath from Finland, but here's a doctor who's writing about health and nutrition, and a lot of the things that he said then still ring true, and now we have very credible scientists and medical doctors, whether it's people like Jeff Bland, who kind of founded functional medicine and has really been a pioneer in the integrative medicine world, and people like Mark Hyman and Mark Stengler and Andrew Weil. There's so many now. Even people that work on mental health issues like Gabor Mate. who are looking for a more holistic approach to healing their patients. And I think one of the reasons why we're here at this place where doctors are kind of peeking over into holistic health is they're recognizing that the medications that they've used for years and years and years aren't doing what they hoped they would do, or they haven't been studied for the length of time that they've been used. Maybe they've been studied for 6 months, but is it okay for patients to be on them for 10 years? I think they're looking for things that might be more helpful, with less questions about whether or not it's safe and appropriate. And I think the other thing that doctors are doing more and more of, which I really relish, is really looking at lifestyle issues, looking at, how do you sleep? Do you eat regularly? What kinds of foods do you eat? Do you take supplements like you said? I have a list of supplements a mile long that I take to my doctor when I go for my annual visits. I'm thankful that they're interested. They want to know. And I remember an old family friend who was a cardiologist who was just maybe 10 years older than I was. I remember in the 90s when he called me and said, I went to a seminar and they were talking about flaxseed and they were talking about vitamin E for cardiovascular health. What do you think about those things? And I thought, I died and go to heaven. I died and went to heaven because, hearing somebody who's got, a medical degree and a specialist in cardiology being interested, it helped me realize that he wanted something beyond a medical approach. So I do see that kind of integration getting more and more. And you also see more and more nurses, pharmacists. There's kind of a growing mutual respect that all the answers don't lie with medicine.
I think also we have to remember that, this is a time when we're getting a little bit more familiar with the term, we don't all fit in the same box.
Mm.
And I think many times over the years, a new prescription would come out and everybody would be put on the same prescription, whether it was for anxiety or stress or blood pressure or cholesterol or blood sugar or something. And the thing is, we don't all respond the same way. So I think a little bit more of that individuality, that little bit of one-on-one, to your point, asking questions about lifestyle and food and diet, and do you get enough rest? How active are you? Do you drink enough water? Do you have a bowel movement every day? How many greens are you eating? What kind of a diet are you following? Because these are crucial questions that for a long time they just weren't asked. And the only people that were asking them were the people in the health food stores. We were asking those to kind of make our job easier so we could narrow things down and give people a better selection of something that could make a difference.
Right. Being in a store that I worked in and having a customer walk in and say, I remember a customer walking in saying, what's your best multivitamin? And he got impatient and frustrated when I said, tell me about your sleep. Tell me about your diet. Tell me how much stress you're under at work. Tell me about your lifestyle. Do you exercise? And he got impatient and said, don't you just have one that's the best? And I said, I want to get something that's the best for you.
Exactly.
Not the best for just anybody because you're unique.
But they're and I understand. I'm the same way. I would love to have a magic wand and make everything what I want with just a wave of a magic wand, or, have a turnkey. But the thing is, even though they can be, impatient with that, that's our way of helping them choose something correctly for them, because what's good for their identical twin may not be good for them.
I've heard you talk about that in the past, about twins.
Yeah, I have 4 couples that I've been waiting on over the years, and they're still identical. I mean, they're older like me, but I mean, they still look exactly the same and they've still got identical genetics, but people live different lives. They eat differently, they travel, their finances are different. One drinks, one doesn't, one smokes, one doesn't, one's underweight, one's overweight. So the thing is, I can get them to the finish line. And I talk about that a lot. But we may need to work individually on the device or the way of transportation to get you to that finish line, because we're not all the same. And I think once we understand, when it happens is somebody goes into like an office situation and they go on a diet and they lose 25 pounds. So everybody's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Well, I'm eating this and I'm doing this. So everybody eats the same. Everybody does the same thing. And only about 10 of them out of 100 lose any weight. Well, I don't know why it's not working for me, because it's probably not for you. It's everybody's different. I'll give you a quick story. You'll love this. I have 5 friends that are upper management CEOs and stuff of hotels in Vegas, and I would get together and have lunch with them. So we'd get together for years. We got together and we would sit down and we would have lunch, and they would just embarrass me to death and just talk about things that were so inappropriate. And so they all decided to start a diet in January one year, doing the same thing, eating the same things, taking the same supplements. And I said, it ain't going to work. Oh, no, you're not following. I said, okay, fine. So we got together like 2 months later. We had lunch. One lost like 15 pounds. One lost like 3 pounds. The other 3, one didn't lose anything, and a couple gained. They go, we don't understand. I said, it's because you're different. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll do a consultation with each of you individually. I'll put you on the thing I think is the best way. And then in a couple months, we'll meet up and see how we're doing. So I met with them individually, and the diets had to be completely different. Their lifestyles were completely not connected. So I set each of them up on a program. Like 60 or 90 days later, we got together. They were all like 20 some odd pounds down. They all did really well. And they just couldn't wrap their mind around it. And I said, look, you guys are different. Everybody needs a different way that works for them. You can't just go with the masses because you think that everybody's right, because your body is going to be like, this is not for me. And you're going to get frustrated. You're going to get upset, and you're going to quit because you're not seeing anything. This way, this is where health food stores and brick and mortar stores come back in, because those one-on-one conversations where it's geared just to you, not to a group, but to you. And that's where success comes from.
Absolutely. That's a great story. I think there are also tools that we can use. There's Ayurveda, there's 5-element theory in traditional Chinese medicine. You can look at somebody's constitution, because some people are flushed and red and intense, and some people are sallow and pale and, thin and deficient. And you have to kind of, and I think intuitively we see that. People who are interested in health, we see those kinds of differences, and we know that somebody who's frail and deficient needs to be built up, and somebody who's heated and robust and over the top needs to be cooled down. And, I think a lot of people in health food stores understand those things because of their experience in the stores, and because a lot of us are educated and are interested in pursuing our education. I think, a continued education, a lifelong education, because we're never finished learning. I studied herbalism and nutrition. I've studied those for many, many years, and I feel like I'm never going to get to the end of it. And, there are some herbalists. I'll just name Paul Schulich for one. There are some herbalists like Paul Schulich who studied a single herb, ginger in his case, for many, many, many years.
Yep. And
wrote a book about ginger and listed the hundreds of constituents of ginger and why they all work. So, there's never a never-ending amount to learn. And the idea of personalization, I think, is really a trend, because people are interested in, what's my DNA say? What does my microbiome say? What is driving my nutritional needs? So we're getting, that's another area where we're in such a good place in history right now, where we have all these tools, both the traditional tools like Ayurvedic doshas and the modern tools like, looking at genetic testing and various other opportunities that we have, so we can really get to the bottom of what do we need. And I don't think you necessarily need those things, because I think a lot of it is evident from how we look, how we feel, what we do. So I agree with you that people in health food stores can help a lot.
I think so as well. There's a lot of positives going on right now. If you were asked if you thought if we were doing something wrong or maybe heading in the wrong direction in the industry, is there something that we could maybe pull back on or change?
I think there's a few things that I think we're doing wrong. I'm going to start with greenwashing. I think there's a tendency to, this has been around for a long time, to put in, a smattering of a few different ingredients and call it a formula that is meaningful to people, when it's really just not enough to really change the trajectory of somebody's life. It's just fairy dust, we call it, right? That it's not enough. And that's kind of evolved into this, let's create a halo of, this is an organic product, or this has one organic ingredient, but it's, a formula with 10 ingredients, and one of the 10 is organic. Or making exaggerated claims on products, I think dovetails with greenwashing, and I think the challenge of having tens of thousands of products on the shelf and many, many more online is that there's a lot of claims being made that may or may not be real, may or may not be proven, may or may not be studied sufficiently. And, I relish and applaud companies like Kyolic, who's been doing clinical research for years. If there's one product, I'll say this about a lot of things, but I was starting to say if there's one product that I really trust, Kyolic is really one of the standouts, because they've been doing clinical studies and research for so long, and we know that aged garlic has an impact on human health because of it. So I think it's important to work with companies that you trust, with companies that have been around, with companies that have some kind of legacy. And the other thing is transparency, and really looking at how are these ingredients listed? Are they listed? Are you getting individual milligrams of each ingredient? Because sometimes that can be really valuable, because if you have a proprietary blend of ingredients, you know that those are supposed to be in order of weight, so the most weight is at the beginning of the ingredient list and the least is at the bottom. But you may not know how much of each ingredient you're getting. So I like things that have more transparency, so you know exactly what's in there. And they're using the Latin binomials for herbs as well as the English names, because then you know exactly what plant it was, and you can tell that they've done diligence and they know what plant they're putting in there. And I appreciate the work of the American Botanical Council so much with their adulteration program, and they've done so much in conjunction with the American Herb Products Association in us, verifying different plants and making sure the right plant is being used, and making sure that adulterants aren't being used. And now, most of the really good companies are doing testing, especially if they're buying from third parties. Yep. Making sure that they're testing each ingredient, not just going by the certificates of analysis that the vendor gives them, so that they know exactly what they're using, so that there's a sense of integrity in the product and integrity in the company as well. And so I'm kind of pointing to the deficiencies by talking about the strengths and what some companies do. And thank goodness for companies like Gaia and Kokora and, many others that really take the time and energy to either grow their own plants and be more vertically integrated in that regard, or, doing the diligence that is appropriate to make sure that the proper ingredients are actually in the product. The other thing that's kind of concerning, but I know there's an opportunity in it, is just consolidation in the industry, and so many companies being bought up by other companies, by large companies, by investment groups. It's a real contrast from the early industry days where it was, like I mentioned, families like the Lumbergs, and the Bronners, and, people who, and the Skolnicks and the Bleckmans and the, people who really, it was their family legacy, that they had integrity in their products. And thank goodness some of those folks are still around. I mean, Amway is still owned by the DeVosses and the Van Andels, I think. So, I mean, talk about old timers. They've been around since the 50s, I think. And it's nice to see that. It's nice to see some companies that are still, have the integrity that they've always had and are selling products that you can trust. Yeah, I think those are some of the, and, exaggerated claims and stuff. That's probably one of my least favorite things in the industry, is people making claims about products. Right now, there's just such a plethora of GLP-1, claims on products, and you just wonder, really? Is that really what people are getting? And are they really misleading people to replace a probiotic with from, instead of using the prescription that their doctor recommended?
Well, interesting to your point, which is really important, out of the tens of thousands of radio shows that I did over the years. And, I had prerequisites, and because I launched hundreds and hundreds of brands and companies. And, my thing was, is it a reputable company? Are they transparent? Are they putting out labels that are easy to read, that are honest and true to the point? And I had some pretty strict standards even back then. Today, it's even worse, because if there's no transparency and the labeling is not honest and it's only proprietary blend labeling, I have a problem with that, because people are looking for more clean, and they're looking for, today the hot thing is, of course, regenerative. It was organic. You and I were around when organic launched. I mean, so now it's regenerative, so we're learning, we're really having more attention to detail, and transparency to me is like the biggest thing. And, I've had people on my show over the years, and with the radio show before, I couldn't say anything about it, because I feel if your company is good and strong and honest and true to point and true to label and transparent, I can have an interview with you and you can tell me all the wonderful things about your company and it stands on its own feet. But if you're someone that only can lift your company up by putting everybody else into the negative category and talking down about everybody in your certain category, that podcast is going to end, boom, that fast. I couldn't do it on live radio before, but I've had to do it a few times on the podcast, because I'm just like, stand on your own feet. Your product should be able to stand on its own. If it's good and it's clean and it's pure, there's room for everybody in the industry out here. You've got plenty of people that can purchase your products, but you shouldn't have to build yourself by moving everybody else down here. That doesn't work. That doesn't jive with me. So the thing is, if you want to come on and you want to talk about your products and how good they are, and the testing and the purity and the labeling and the glass bottles, and the no excipients and all that stuff, let's do that. Let's talk about it. Let's let people know what's out there, but don't bring the negativity to it, because there's no room for that on my show, and there shouldn't be any room on anybody's show out there for that.
During my career, I was a buyer for Whole Foods and did product curation for supplements and body care products for decades. And it was really fun, and it was really interesting and telling, who would come, what kinds of products would come to my desk. And it was a lot of sorting through and a lot of learning as I went, what kinds, learning the regulatory issues so that I would know how to read a label and I would know when there was a mistake made. And, when things weren't in the proper order, or when, something else on the label was wrong because because the unit of measure wasn't in the right place, or the name of the company wasn't listed properly, or, all the regulatory issues, and really trying to hone our selection in the region that I oversaw, which was 59 stores ultimately. And it was a real learning experience, because there were a lot of products that would come across my desk that weren't labeled properly, that didn't have that level of integrity that we're talking about, and transparency. And they didn't use the language that they were supposed to use, or they made exaggerated claims that weren't appropriate.
Yep.
And there are some claims that have always been kind of hot and challenging. Because of the exaggerations, and that a lot of that has to do with weight management and energy, I think those two categories are rife with exaggerated claims. And those are things that you can educate yourself about, and you can trust, people in the health food stores to lead you into the right, the right choices, to help you with the choices, because, there is so much. And, there's health food stores, and there's all the online, and there's all the social media, and the information's coming at us from so many different perspectives. It's good to kind of center yourself and, ask a trusted friend, or ask your doctor, or ask your pharmacist, or ask your health food store person. And, everybody, you can glean information from every source. And I think it's good. The more questions we ask, the better the information we're going to get is.
I agree. So, first of all, thank you so much for everything you have done in our wonderful industry over the years.
My pleasure.
Number two, thank you for all the things you're going to do moving forward, which of course is always going to be fantastic. Thank you for being here today. And now I have two questions for you. The first one is, leave us with a thought of the day.
I think the thought of the day, off the top of my head, it's really trust your gut, trust your instincts. If something feels not right to you, don't do it. Or, if a product seems like it's got exaggerated claims, don't buy it, and really, like you've said, really focus on the perimeter of the store when you're shopping, because what you're going to get the most, I hate the phrase bang for your buck. I have to think of something instead of that, but where you're really going to benefit it when you're talking about food, actually in general, when you're talking about health, one of the primary ways the outside environment affects the inside of our bodies is through food. So let's choose food wisely. Let's really pick food that's going to be nourishing and nutritive. And thank goodness there's so many choices, and we have, food available year round that's amazing. And we can choose organic food a lot. And sometimes even regenerative organic food. And that's going to be not only the best for us, but the best for the planet. I think it's really important to focus on both of those things, because, it's kind of like a rising tide floats all boats. We need to be taking care of the farm workers. We need to be taking care of the water supply, the groundwater, the soil. And I'm getting off of the target of, my thought for the day. But trusting your gut, I think, encompasses all of that, because we know about how a healthy environment impacts us. So try to seek out healthy environments for yourself.
I love that.
And that includes, taking a walk out in nature, and that includes choosing the right foods and supplements in the stores when you buy them.
I love that. Okay, question number two. You leave the planet today. What does Robin want to be remembered for?
Well, there's a few things. I don't know. I don't know if I can pick just one. The thing that comes to mind first is kindness, because I think there's so many people out there in the world that are just, they've got their BB guns out and they're trying to shoot holes at each other. And I want to just really stay away from that. I want to be kind with people that I interact with. And I know that gets reciprocated. So I want that in my life. And the more kind we are, I think the more kindness we receive. So I think that's something that jumps out as one of the things that I'd like to be remembered for, because I hope that people think of me as somebody who's been kind. And because I have a lot of contacts throughout the industry, and, I've been working in the natural products industry for a long time, I've had the opportunity, to interact with a lot of people. So that's one of the things. And the other thing I think that's really important to me is integrity. I want to have personal integrity. I want the products that I represent to have integrity. I want the companies that make the products to have integrity. Those are things that are really critical in my mind. And I struggle sometimes because, I've been offered jobs by people that I just kind of would go, oh dear, no, I don't think so. And I think it's, the experience that I have allows me to discern, so it's part of my own desire to be a knowledgeable and trustworthy source of information that I want anybody that I interact with to be, have that same level of integrity.
I love that. I've been talking with Robin Rogosin today. I hope you loved this as much as I did. It was fantastic. And make sure that you visit the podcast often. Make sure you go to the YouTube channel and subscribe. Bring all your friends to subscribe. Remember, building the YouTube channel allows me to get these awesome interviews out to everyone. So just remember, show up, listen to the podcast. I'm going to bring you the best of the best, all good things in good health and well-being from inside and outside the natural products industry. Robin, I had such a great time today. Will you come back and see us again?
Of course. And it's my pleasure always to talk with you, Jeffrey.
You be well, you take care, and keep up the good work, because you're an amazing icon in the industry, and I think you've done amazing things. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. Absolutely.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. Be well, stay healthy, and God bless.
Stay tuned for more information from the Honest Health Podcast with Jeffrey Burke. And make sure to check back often for interviews and conversations from the guests we all want to hear from. I'm John the Announcer. Thanks for listening.